Students of Gettysburg know the story of how the battle got started. General John Buford, Union cavalry officer in command of a division of dismounted cavalry, set up positions west of town to block the way for the lead elements of the Confederate Third Corps in the form of Harry Heath's division. They held off for a couple of hours while desperately sending messages to the infantry to come here with all possible speed. Reynolds knew that he had to get there because he and Buford were friends, and he trusted Buford's judgment, and Buford said, "This is ground we have to defend." And so as the cavalry held off furious attacks from the Confederates, he waited for those lead elements of infantry to arrive. And when they did, it was the division of General James Wadsworth. Wadsworth had two brigades. Lysander Cutler's brigade went into battle on the right side, and they actually fired the first shots of infantry in the Battle of Gettysburg. For the Union, it was the 56th Pennsylvania. On the left side, it was the brigade of Solomon Meredith, men from the West, as it was then known, the 2nd, 6th, and 7th Wisconsin, the 19th Indiana, and the 24th Michigan. We know them today as the Iron Brigade. Today I want to tell their story. The Iron Brigade, as we know it today, was composed of Wisconsin, Michigan, and Indiana troops. They earned that famous nickname while under the command of a North Carolinian, Brigadier General John Gibbon, who led them into their first battle. On August 28, 1862, during the first phases of what we know today as the Second Battle of Bull Run, the brigade stood up against superior forces under Stonewall Jackson. But it was at their next engagement that they would earn their famous name, the Iron Brigade. That name is said to have originated during the brigade's actions at Turner's Gap, which was a part of the Battle of South Mountain, which was then a part of Lee's first invasion of the North, which culminated in the Battle of Antietam in September of 1862. Joe Hooker, who was in command of the First Corps, approached General McClellan, who was the Army commander of the Army of the Potomac, looking for orders. As the brigade advanced up the National Road, forcing the Confederate line all the way back to the Gap, McClellan asked Hooker, "What troops are those fighting in the pike?" And Hooker is said to have replied, "General Gibbon's brigade of Western boys." To which McClellan is supposed to have said, "Well, they must be made of iron." Hooker said that the brigade had fought even better a few weeks earlier at Second Bull Run, to which McClellan then replied that he thought they must consist of the best troops in the world. Hooker was so excited that one of his brigades had received such high praise from the Army commander that he rode off back toward the battle without ever receiving orders. Now, there are other stories that have been told concerning the origin of the name Iron Brigade, but what we do know is that very soon after the Battle of South Mountain, the name began to appear in print. Around 10:15 on the morning of July 1st, Confederate Brigadier General James Archer's brigade, which was comprised of 1,100 men, approached Gettysburg from the west, intent on pushing the cavalry off the ridges on the outskirts of town. I'm standing now on McPherson's Ridge. Behind me is Seminary Ridge. Archer's brigade was the 1st, the 4th, the 7th Tennessee, the 13th Alabama. Archer was unaware that the Iron Brigade had entered Gettysburg from the south, and they were marching along the Emmitsburg Road, and they were now approaching his position west of the Herbst Woods near Willoughby Run. The 1,800 men of the Iron Brigade under General Solomon Meredith marched into position. The units were thrown into the battle as soon as they arrived, and they made their way west toward the advancing Confederates. So you have Archer's brigade coming from the west, you have Meredith's brigade pushing from the east. The 2nd Wisconsin advanced forward without even waiting for the other regiments toward the Herbst Woods behind me. The 7th and 14th Tennessee regiments opened fire on the 2nd Wisconsin, and they suffered devastating casualties. It was at this moment that General John Reynolds, who was in command of the entire wing of the Union Army, was killed in the spot marked behind me. He was always to be found in the thick of the fight, and he was turning around, facing back toward his men to encourage those men as they went into the woods and into the fight, and he fell dead from a bullet to the back of his head. The 7th Wisconsin approached quickly and came to the aid of the 2nd Wisconsin. The 19th Indiana and the 24th Michigan stopped to form their lines and then hurried to support the Wisconsin regiments. When they saw the supporting regiments approaching, the 13th Alabama fell back. Next in line was the 1st and the 4th Tennessee, and the Iron Brigade quickly closed in. Soon all of Archer's brigade was in full retreat, and the 24th Michigan was able to wrap around the retreating Confederates as the pressure from the front continued to push them. The Iron Brigade killed close to 350 Confederates and captured an additional 240, including General Archer himself. During the back and forth struggle in the woods where I'm standing now on July 1st, Private Patrick Maloney of the 2nd Wisconsin spotted an opportunity in this field behind me, just on the opposite side of Willoughby Run. His regiment had just charged the Tennesseans that opposed them. They drove them back across Willoughby Run, and as they continued the pursuit, Maloney, who was, quote, a brave, patriotic, and fervent young Irishman, identified among the rebels none other than Brigadier General James Archer, whose men the Iron Brigade were up against. Now, without hesitating, Maloney plunged into the southern line and grabbed Archer, who initially tried to resist but was very soon overwhelmed. This young private Maloney brought his captive back to his commanding officer, Major John Mansfield, who in turn placed Archer in the hands of another Irishman in the 2nd Wisconsin, Lieutenant Dennis Daly. Now, according to Daly, Archer was so shaken by his encounter with this young 2nd Wisconsin private that the general appealed, quote, for protection from Maloney. Patrick Maloney's actions had resulted in the first capture of an Army of Northern Virginia general since Robert E. Lee had taken command over a year earlier. Maloney would receive the Medal of Honor for his actions in capturing Archer. Now, the importance of his contribution was enough to merit a note in his commanding officer's official report on the Battle of July 1st at Gettysburg. Major Mansfield wrote, "I ordered a charge upon this last position of the enemy, which was gallantly made at the double quick, the enemy breaking in confusion to the rear, escaping from the timber into the open fields beyond. In this charge we captured a large number of prisoners, including several officers, among them General Archer, who was taken by Private Patrick Maloney of Company G of our regiment. Archer was brought to me, to whom he surrendered his sword, which I passed over with the prisoners to Lieutenant D.B. Daly, who was the acting aide-de-camp on the brigade staff. I regret to say that this gallant soldier, Private Maloney, was killed in the action later that day. While the rest of the Iron Brigade was fighting south of the road, going into the woods toward Willoughby Run, the 6th Wisconsin, under Lieutenant Colonel Rufus Dawes, joined units on the north side of the road. They charged across this field behind me, moving toward the north, because there was a brigade of Mississippians and North Carolinians under Joe Davis that had turned this area behind me, known as the Railroad Cut, into a natural fortification. It was a beautiful spot as long as you could hold it. You can see just how deep it is. It was unfinished at the time. There was no railroad here, but they had cut through this area to place a railroad that exists here to this day. The men would come up here, and it was basically like an entrenchment. They could lay on the side with only their heads and their arms and their guns sticking up, firing, pouring deadly fire into the 6th Wisconsin as they came across this field. But Dawes led his men in a furious charge, losing nearly half of their 420 men as they charged across this field. Eventually, though, they made their way to the railroad cut. And now the railroad cut, rather than being a strong fortification, it turned into a death trap. The Union men had their guns pointed down at the Mississippians. Over 200 of the Mississippians here in the railroad cut surrendered to Dawes's men. Dawes walked away with an armful of swords from the officers who surrendered to his command. It was a glorious day for the Iron Brigade. It was a glorious day for the 6th Wisconsin, but they paid for it dearly with many lives. After driving back and effectively destroying Archer's brigade, the Iron Brigade eventually had to fall back to a position here on McPherson's Ridge. It was a better defensive position. It allowed for them to receive the waves of Confederate assaults that continued throughout the morning and into the early afternoon. On the left of the Iron Brigade eventually was one of the all-time elite showdowns of combat on a Civil War battlefield. It was the 26th North Carolina of Pettigrew's brigade versus the 24th Michigan of the Iron Brigade, two of the largest regiments on either side during the battle, and they would suffer two of the heaviest casualty numbers of any units during the American Civil War. At one point, the fighting got so fierce that they were 20 paces away from each other, firing volleys. Can you even imagine standing with hundreds of men, 20 paces from hundreds of enemy men, firing full volleys into each other. You can't miss at that distance. These are accurate weapons out to a few hundred yards. It was devastating, and the casualty figures show that. The 26th North Carolina was raised in 1861 from central and western parts of the state, with Zebulon Vance as its first colonel. Vance was elected governor of North Carolina in 1862, and command of the unit passed to 20-year-old Colonel Henry King Burgoyne Jr. The 26th spent the next year defending the North Carolina coast. They saw their first action at New Bern, North Carolina. They then went north and fought in the 7 Days battles before returning to North Carolina. In 1863, they marched northwards and became attached to the Army of Northern Virginia, where they were given the distinction of being not only the largest regiment in the Army, but also one of the best trained. They joined General Pettigrew's brigade, which was attached to Heath's division of A.P. Hill's 3rd Corps at Gettysburg. Pettigrew's brigade came into action later into the morning and into the early part of the afternoon here at Gettysburg, and it was here that the 26th North Carolina marched into battle with 800 men. They suffered heavy casualties during their fight with one of the largest regiments in the Army of the Potomac, the 24th Michigan. They lost Burgoyne, they lost their lieutenant colonel, and they lost 588 men out of a strength of 800. But they forced the 24th into a retreat. They lost about another 120 to 140 men in Pickett's charge on July 3rd, leaving the 26th North Carolina with one of the highest casualty rates of any unit in any battle in all of history. The brigade saw heavy action again around 3:45 p.m. as they formed a defensive line along with other Union regiments against the Confederates as they assaulted Seminary Ridge. The Union lines were crumbling north and west of the town as the Confederates kept up the attack. Although the Union lines were stretched really thin along Seminary Ridge, they did have good artillery support, and they were continually ready for a fight. They lined up against 3 fresh brigades totaling 5,000 men under Confederate Major General Dorsey Pender. At this point, there were fewer than 2,300 exhausted Union troops, but they readied themselves for the inevitable assault behind makeshift barricades. But many of the men were out in the open. Four South Carolina regiments, the 1st, the 12th, the 13th, and the 14th, assaulted the Union lines and exploited a gap on the left between the infantry and dismounted cavalry on the flank. The Union flank was rolled up, and one by one, the Union regiments retreated off of Seminary Ridge and down through the town of Gettysburg. Although the Iron Brigade was eventually driven from the field, their courage and their fighting skill on July 1st slowed the Confederate advance into Gettysburg and helped to secure the high ground south of town, which would eventually decide the battle. Despite having suffered catastrophic losses on July 1st, the Iron Brigade remained on the line. Just behind me, you can see a monument on the ground showing the spot where the 24th Michigan mustered 99 men on July 2nd and 3rd. Here, Stevens Knoll is behind me with the statue of Henry Slocum there, and then we're making our way up to Culp's Hill behind me, and this would have been the line of the Iron Brigade where everybody's walking. 99 men out of well over 500 that the 24th Michigan started the battle with, and yet they were still here on the line. They would have witnessed the attack taking place on East Cemetery Hill there, and they would have been in near proximity to the attacks that were taking place on Culp's Hill, which we are climbing now. Now we're closer to the center of where the Iron Brigade's line would have been, and you can see we're well up into Culp's Hill now. Here's the 2nd Wisconsin line there, run down here, and then the 7th Wisconsin was to their left, and then the 24th Michigan further down the hill there. But we are into the woods now. We are not nearly to the top of Culp's Hill, but we're on kind of the slope that runs toward East Cemetery Hill, Stevens Knoll, then East Cemetery Hill, and then right just behind me where those cars are is where the top, I don't know if you can see the car or not, but that's where the top of Culp's Hill is.